you're enjoying my introduction to our Viking war music. This is Viking battle music, such as we think it might have been played in the early Middle Ages. And if listening to this doesn't make you want to put on your hat with horns, your armor, and go pillage the next town over, well, something's the matter with you. But that's okay, because now we are beginning our last unit of the early Middle Ages, our unit on the Vikings. Up till now, we have been doing the Carolingians, and we've presented the Carolingians as this kind of golden age in this time period. The early Middle Ages, the years from 500 to 1500, have often been seen as a kind of dark age. Well, that's clearly an exaggeration. Clearly, we cannot say there were 1,000 years of darkness, starting with the fall of Rome and ending with the Renaissance. That doesn't make sense, based on what you know now. The time of Charlemagne, from the year 800 to 850, at the very least, that was a kind of Renaissance. It's called the Carolingian Renaissance, a sort of bright time, a bright spot, a mini golden age between the dark and the dark. Now, you've been doing history long enough now to realize anytime there's a golden age, there's a crash. Well, today we are talking about the crash. This makes the point. A lot of the story of this year is the rise and fall of civilizations. The rise of the Carolingians was a great time, but now we are on the fall, the time of the Vikings. Charlemagne himself, you remember, was a kind of Germanic king, the king of the Franks, who managed to reestablish a sort of Roman Empire called the Holy Roman Empire. He was a Germanic warrior, a sincere Christian, trying to be a Roman emperor, and he laid the stage for much of the medieval culture that would come. But that had to wait, because almost right after Charlemagne dies, things fall apart. And things fall apart surprisingly quickly. His heirs are not as strong as he is. It's not completely their fault. The Germans had this slightly weird practice. Normally, when a king died, the empire or kingdom, we think, would go to the oldest son. Not for the Carolingians. They thought this wasn't fair. So what they would do is they would divide the empire between their sons. So Charlemagne divided his kingdom between his three sons. Then one of his three sons divided it among his three sons. So the Holy Roman Empire got smaller and smaller and smaller, and this contributes to things falling apart. This is called equigeniture. Equa from the word equal, and geniture is like primogeniture. Everybody, every son, inherits equally. Sounds fair, but it means the kingdom gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And then all of those brothers are fighting with each other because they want to take everything over. Because if there's one thing you know about Germanic warriors, they like fighting. Even when they become Christians, like Charlemagne, they still like fighting. And unfortunately, this means the Carolingian Empire is getting weaker and weaker, just as they're about to be attacked by sea raiders. Ooh, sea raiders, that sounds familiar. Possibly like the sea raiders who conquered Egypt. Well, the same thing is going on during this time period. The Carolingian Empire falls. It's an old story. A combination of internal weaknesses, that is, weakness on the inside, and invasion on the outside. That should sound familiar to you. That is why most of the empires we've talked about end up falling. You can generally survive one. You can survive trouble on the outside if you're united and things are going well on the inside, or vice versa. But when everything goes wrong at once, that's when you get into trouble. Well, Carolingian Empire falls because of weakness on the inside, civil war. That definitely sounds familiar. You should be thinking of Rome now. All of Charlemagne's sons and grandsons fighting amongst themselves over who should get to rule. And while this is going on, Carolingian Empire is invaded by a new force, the Vikings. Sometimes they're called the Vikings, sometimes the Norse, sometimes the Northmen. Men who came from the north because they were from the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden. Much like Beowulf, actually. And so this is the time period from 900 to 1050. This is definitely another dark age. 150 years of Viking attacks tearing through Europe. And there wasn't much anyone in Europe could do about it. Now, culturally, the Vikings should sound kind of familiar because they actually have a lot of similarities to the Germanic tribes we've talked about. They're very warlike. War was a way of life. They fight in relatively small clans, small family groups of about 50 people, enough to be hit and run armies. They're hard to stop. They fight so they can get loot. With loot, you can reward your followers. The other thing you get from fighting is prestige. So obviously, this should look very, very familiar at this point. Viking culture is a gift culture. Gifts are a way to establish personal relationships. So just the same way, Beowulf gives two gifts to his followers. That's not just a nice present. That means now his followers owe him. They owe him their loyalty. Again, this is Viking culture. Gifts establish personal relationships. If I take a gift from you, that's not the end of the story. That means now I owe you. So, where does this wealth come from? This wealth comes from warfare. You have war bands led by chieftains seeking loot and seeking plunder. They attack all over Europe. Most of all, well, maybe not most of all, but to a great extent, they attack churches and monasteries. Wait, why churches and monasteries, you ask? I assume you're asking. They attack churches and monasteries, one, because churches and monasteries are defenseless. Monks don't fight, at least not physically. Remember, monks are trying to tell the Germans they're doing heroic, manly, spiritual warfare against the devil by praying and fasting, but they don't have weapons. So churches and monasteries are easy targets. Second thing, churches and monasteries have valuables. Not that they're rich on their own, but people like them. Charlemagne likes them, so people donate money to them. So the Vikings attack churches and monasteries frequently. The way one monk put it in a fictional account, supposedly based on a true story, when the Vikings come, the only thing you can do is run and hope you're fast enough. They tear many of these monasteries to the ground. Iona, Kells, you see some of them here. These are some of the famous monasteries in the Middle Ages. They're built along the coast. Iona is built on an island at sea. It's a beautiful area, but think about that, being built on the coast, an island at sea, perfect targets for the Vikings, and there's not much anyone can do about it. One of the reasons the Vikings are so deadly is because of the Viking longboats. This is actually the main difference between the Vikings and the early Germanic warriors. The Viking longboats allow them to attack almost anywhere in Europe. What do you mean, Dr. Danstro? Anywhere in Europe, they're boats. They can't sail on land. Surely they just sail on the coast. No, literally anywhere in Europe, because Europe has rivers going all through it, from Europe to the sea, even into the heartland of Europe. Now, these rivers are too shallow for any large ships to sail on, but the Viking longboats are very shallow on the draft. They can sail in a very small amount of water. So the Vikings in their longboats can sail down the rivers, attack the heartland of Europe, show up completely without warning, and then be gone before the army could get there. So this allows Viking warriors to launch fast, hit-and-run raids all over Europe and to be gone long before the Carolingians can respond. And there's nothing the Carolingians can do about it. This tears Europe to shreds. Throughout Europe, the Franks, the Carolingian Empire, they're hurt the worst of all. the Carolingians have this enormous empire to defend. They don't have a standing army. And anytime the Vikings show up, someone raises the alarm, the Vikings are here, the Vikings are here, send for the army. By the time the army gets there, it's too late. Which means the kings, the Carolingian kings, can no longer protect their people. And no one is going to be loyal to a king that can't protect his people. And so the Carolingian kings start to fall apart. Some of them pay tribute to the Vikings, but that only buys them a little bit of time because, again, who's going to respect a king who can't defend his people, who has to pay tribute? So far in this unit, we've talked about the Carolingians as a short golden age, a kind of mini renaissance between the Dark Ages before and the Dark Ages after. But like all golden age, it comes crashing down. It comes crashing down through a combination of internal problems, civil war, fighting amongst themselves, and external problems, the attacks of the Vikings. The Vikings are very much like Germanic warrior culture, violent, aggressive. They fight for loot, plunder, pillage. They launch hit-and-run raids through Europe, and they tear Europe to shreds. Europe is now in a kind of dark age, and the Europeans have to figure out how to survive this. And this will last for 150 years. In the next video, we'll talk about what happens to Europe and how they try to pull themselves together to survive this dark age.